On the morning of October 17, 2025, miles inside Kherson Oblast, a shadow war took place. Ukrainian drones, silent and patient, hunted something rare, a Russian Tornado-S multiple launch rocket system. It was one of Moscow's most advanced long-range artillery weapons. For months, this system had inflicted heavy damage on Ukrainian cities like Kherson, Mykolaiv, and Zaporizhzhia, striking from far beyond the front lines. Capable of firing guided rockets over 120 kilometers, the Tornado-S was built to hit, retreat, and vanish before anyone could track it. Until this day. Lasar's group, which is Ukraine's elite drone unit, had been watching. Intelligence had tracked the launcher moving across an open field, attempting to hide among trees. But there are no secrets left when the sky has eyes. Moments later, a kamikaze drone descended, hitting the launcher dead on. Seconds after, a second strike followed. The detonation lit up the horizon. What had once been Russia's pride weapon was now burning metal. The site was nearly 50 kilometers behind Russian lines. The drones had flown low, over rivers and farmland, avoiding radar to deliver the strike. For Ukrainian forces, this wasn't just another hit. It was history. It was the first confirmed collapse of a Tornado-S system since the war began. But the actual question is that, was this just a lucky hit, or the start of a new phase where drones begin to hunt Russia's biggest guns one by one? The inspection for this operation began in the earliest hours of the day at 8:13 a.m. Analysts in a modest operations room in southern Ukraine were already 2 hours into their day, scrolling through sensor mosaics and amateur videos. They have noticed a pattern building for weeks. There were reports of long-range rocket salvos, impact trajectories that suggested a high-end launcher, and a handful of open-source clips showing a heavy vehicle moving near a woodline. The unit responsible for the hunt called themselves Lasar's Group. They were small, precise, and built around drone warfare. At approximately 9:05 a.m., the initial confirmation arrived from two sources at once. A roadside camera had caught a long frame on a dirt track. A human source at a nearby village had snapped a photo of a heavy launcher entering a field, then hiding under trees. Imagery analysts also pulled the frames into a sequence and saw the telltale signs of a multiple launch rocket system. That was the first key, visual confirmation in context. It moved the case from suspicion to probable target. At approximately 9:20, the signals team stepped fully into the picture. For days, they had been eavesdropping on the invisible chatter around that sector, not listening for speeches, but for machine sounds and small, repeating patterns that people seldom notice. At first, it was a rhythm in the background, little bursts that could have been test transmissions or handheld radios. Then the pattern grew clearer. Short, directed pulses began appearing in the logs at nearly the exact times each day. They were too regular to be coincidence. Those pulses meant something important. They suggested a crew was in place and running equipment. They told the launcher was not abandoned or a decoy. But a brilliant analyst knows how easy it is to be fooled, so they did not celebrate. Instead, they treated the signal like a lead in a mystery. They checked its timing against everything else they had. One cross-check was simple timing. The team compared the moments those radio bursts showed up with the satellite images and drone snapshots taken the same day. When the pulses lined up with frames that showed a vehicle parked in firing posture, the signal jumped from suspicious to useful. Another cross-check used signal shape. Experienced SIGINT operators can tell the difference between a casual voice call and the kind of machine chatter produced by generator-driven radios or remote telemetry. The burst pattern here matched what they had seen from other launch crews who were preparing a salvo. They also ran a test for false flags. In past weeks, the enemy had tried to confuse watchers by activating radios at fake coordinates or by setting up noise generators that mimicked real activity. The analysts looked for that and for telltale mistakes. When a noise generator is used, it often repeats too cleanly. Real crews produce small human errors, timing slips, and variations in tone. This signal had those human flaws. It breathed like a live unit. Another useful check was the thermal timeline. The SIGINT timestamps were compared with thermal scans taken from overhead at the same minute. Whenever the burst occurred there, small heat anomalies showed up where equipment warmed up, like engines idling or electronics powering up. That made the signal much more reliable. As the evidence gathered, operations planners began to sketch a window for action. They did not pick a time at random. They looked for a period when the crew seemed present, but support elements were not nearby, when civilian movement was low, and when weather and satellite passes gave good coverage. If the signature had come at night, they would have chosen different tools. But the pattern now suggested a morning window would be best. Then, the strike cell met on the video wall. Operations officers, legal advisors, intelligence analysts, and the drone pilots themselves discussed options. The legal team stressed two constraints: no strike during confirmed civilian presence and high confidence in target ID. Politically, the team briefed a senior command element that this was not a routine interdiction. A Tornado S-class launcher, if that is what it was, had fired long-range rockets at towns and civilian areas. Removing it would lessen those strikes. At around 10:42, the reconnaissance grew 10 times stronger. Small aerial drones were sent to overwatch at a safe distance, their pilots instructed to record and not engage. Analysts watched for firing posture. They needed to see the system go through the motions that show it is ready to fire. The goal was not to hit a parked vehicle, but to confirm an operational crew. To that end, they looked for specific signs: orientated launch rails, vehicle stabilizers deployed, spent canisters or crates in place. When those signs appeared, the mission entered the final phase. At 11:34, the team finally recorded a run. The launcher rolled into a clearing, orientated itself, and then back toward cover. Thermal observations registered warm equipment and human activity around the vehicle. For planners, this was the last reassurance they wanted. They had a narrow window when the crew would be close enough to be confirmed, but before any mass support arrived, they set strike parameters and pre-positioned assets. Importantly, they prepared abort criteria. If civilians moved into the area, or if heavier enemy air assets arrived, the strike would not go. The loitering strike platforms were already airborne. Pilots who had been briefed for this sort of job checked their systems, each on a different frequency and connected to separate command links so that if one feed went off, another would remain. The teams used two layers of strike assets. The first layer consisted of longer endurance kamikaze loitering munitions that could search and strike a vehicle-sized target. The second layer consisted of small, fast, short-range drones that could finish disabled hardware or ensure stored munitions were rendered harmless. That redundancy is what made the difference. At 12:14 p.m., a cue came from the Overwatch drone. It sent a crisp video. The launcher. Tucked into a thin line of trees, crew moving, gear warm. The voice on the comms said go. The first kamikaze drone, a loitering munition designed for precision strikes, slipped over the tree line and descended. The whole event happened fast. A measured burst of activity in what had been a quiet patch of countryside. The first impact disabled the launcher's aiming optics and damaged its stabilization outriggers. The crew reacted instantly, scattering toward nearby vehicles and trying to shield their gear. The initial strike had not intended to detonate the rockets, only to make the system unable to fire. That objective was met. The rapid reaction of men on the ground, however, meant the danger of stored rockets remained. That is where the second waveform of attack came in. The finishing blow arrived seconds later at 12:17 p.m. A pair of short-range drones dove in, striking storage areas and the reload crates. The sequence produced a loud secondary blast. That blast had two consequences. It dismantled a large portion of the rocket stock and it warned any nearby units that the area was now hazardous. The secondary detonation was the unmistakable signal that the launcher could not be used again in the near term. Planners did not risk immediate boots-on-ground entry. They watched from above. Smoke rose, and sensors mapped heat signatures across the clearing. They noted their successes and the remaining risks. The team recorded the orientation of the wreck and the spread of debris. That information would be needed for post-strike analysis and to corroborate the identity of the system. Forensics went to work from a distance. Imagery analysts combed the video frame by frame to pick out hardware fragments, sequence of detonation, and casualty risks. Open-source investigators collected civilian video and cross-referenced timestamps. In parallel, electronic warfare teams listened for attempts at comms restoration or for jamming that might indicate enemy movement. The raw data was shared with Central Command to build a public narrative. In the hours after the strike, fragments of the story leaked out. A local source posted shaky footage showing a column of smoke and a field littered with metal. A clip circulated of the initial strike and the secondary blast. Analysts compared the pattern of debris with known profiles of Tornado S and BM-30 Smerch systems. The shape of the launcher and the placement of the launch rails suggested a modernized system, consistent with accounts that linked long-range strikes in the area to Tornado S weapons. At 1:30 p.m., word reached higher command that the launcher had been neutralized. Tactical value was immediate. The towns that had been under periodic long-range bombardment experienced a reprieve. Local defensive lines could breathe without the threat of a sudden 120-kilometer strike. The psychological effect mattered too. Soldiers on the front took heart from a visible removal of a menacing weapon. But victory invited adaptation. By late afternoon, reports started coming in of changes in enemy behavior. Russian units began dispersing heavy launchers, operating under civilian camouflage, and shifting to shoot and scoot patterns with shorter dwell times. That cat-and-mouse game was expected. The attackers had known any success would prompt change, which is why the planning cell emphasized patience and evidence before acting. Lessons written into the after-action report emphasized patient observation and legal certainty. The operation had rested on the integration of human reports, imagery confirmation, and signals intercepts. It had relied on 2 waves of drones that complemented each other. It had avoided a wider firefight and minimized the risk of civilian harm. The planners highlighted that eliminating a launcher in the open field had more strategic value than a high-tempo raid that risked collateral damage. Diplomacy and information operations followed. Ukrainian channels released footage and statements emphasizing the removal of a weapon that had targeted civilians. International observers and open-source analysts cross-checked the evidence and, in many cases, endorsed the conclusion that a high-value launcher had been knocked out of action. Opposing information threads sought to minimize the loss or claim the system was an older model. In the fog of war, both sides pushed their narratives. Over the next days, the defenders hardened their practices. Launchers were moved more frequently and integrated into dispersed logistics. They began operating with more escorts and with decoy vehicles. That raised the cost for attackers, but it also offered new signs for watchers. More movement meant more observable patterns. The attackers adjusted too. Their intelligence teams learned where defenders tried to hide and what signals betrayed those positions. In the end, the operation read like a compact study in modern conflict. Patient intelligence gathering, careful legal and ethical checks, layered sensor confirmation, and a targeted strike using complementary drone types. The disabled launcher was both a practical win and a symbol. It showed that long-range artillery could be hunted, and that tabletop calculations of safety at rear areas were no longer guaranteed. For those on the ground in Kherson, and for family members in quiet towns that had been shelled, the news was simple and immediate. A dangerous gun had been taken away. For planners and strategists, the victory was a test case. It proved a method, but not a panacea. The next phase would be adaptation, learning, and more patient watching. Because in this war, every advantage invited a countermove, and every strike whispered a lesson into the other side's ear. As dawn crept over Kherson, the forest was still smoking. What had once been Russia's deadliest launcher was now just twisted metal in the dirt. For months, that Tornado S had haunted Ukrainian skies. Now it was nothing but a scar on the map. In a war where every meter feels like a lifetime, this single strike meant something bigger. That even Moscow's untouchable weapons could be neutralized if planned well. Somewhere in a command room, a team watched the final feed fade to static. They didn't cheer. They just marked the mission complete. Because in this war, silence after the blast is victory. If you found this story powerful, please subscribe and share. Your support helps us bring more untold battles to light.